Planar scholars across every world, every setting, and every era will proudly point you to a diagram, a painstakingly rendered abstract illustration pressed between the pages of some academic manual of the planes and presented with the confidence of a wise sage who has spent a lifetime in planar study, absolutely certain they have mapped the unmappable. Those who have traveled the myriad lands of Dungeons & Dragons long enough have seen at least one of these grand cosmic maps. A wheel, perhaps. A great cosmic wheel, its many spokes radiating outward from a central hub, each one terminating in a realm of pure ideological conviction. Or maybe it was a tree, an ancient world tree whose roots descend into the divine dark and whose branches hold the heavens of 100 gods. Perhaps even some eccentric sage shared their truth as an axis, centered on the mortal world, twin echoes to its sides, a silvery void above where divine dominions in all shades of good and evil float like planetary islands, while far below, a grinding, ever-shifting chaos of raw matter and untamed elements threatens to consume it all. These are the cosmologies of the multiverse. 3 diagrams, 3 maps, 3 different answers to the same burning question, drawn by different hands across different editions of the known history. This exploration acknowledges that other models on other worlds exist. Eberron turns to its own Ori of 13 planes, while Ravenloft's domains of dread lie detached behind the mists, cut off and governed by laws of their own. But for Greyhawk, Planescape, and the Forgotten Realms, the 3 models that make up today's cosmic exploration across every edition of the lore carried their own arguments that would shape the multiverse. But none of them are absolute, and yet none are entirely wrong. The cosmologies of Dungeons & Dragons cannot be defined on a map in any sense that an expedition planning cartographer would find at all useful. They are the concepts of mortal minds trying to grapple with questions too vast and too abstract. You do not travel to the abyss or the 7 heavens in the same manner by which you travel to the next kingdom or village. They are not borders separated by ocean depths or mountainous peaks. They are, in many respects, a map of the mind. The planes exist as destinations, states of reality, divine dominions, and surreal realms shaped by influence, ideology, and even belief, with each model emphasizing different aspects of that equation. And that is why no single diagram ever quite does the job, or ever will. Yet the attempts by mortal hands to diagram the undiagrammable will continue, always seeking to answer the same question every edition of Dungeons & Dragons lore has had to address before it could build anything else. What is the shape of all things? Now that you know what the cosmology is, your next question might be, why should you care? Cosmology matters because it is the constitution of reality. A king may write laws for a single kingdom. A tyrant may even rule a continent. But cosmology decides the laws nobody gets to vote on. What happens when your mortal story reaches its end? Whether the soul belongs to the god you served, the devil who bought it, or an unseen power waiting in the dark beyond both. It gives gods dominions to rule and fiends authority to scheme. It determines whether a Faerunian cleric's desperate prayer reaches a distant god, if a Thean necromancer can draw upon death as a force of nature, and whether resurrection is a miracle of life renewed or a theft that risks drawing attention from powers who believe the dead have already been properly assigned. The cosmological model is where the setting stops being a collection of isolated adventures and starts behaving like a world. And without it, the lore of all things, living or dead, are all just names waiting for a plot to use them. The cosmology shapes monster ecology, divine politics, alignment mechanics, the stakes of nearly every high-level adventure, and the entire philosophical framework upon which any given edition hangs its world-building. Cosmology gives a world and each of its stories vertical scale, and when an edition changes its cosmological model, it changes, well, everything. That is why these cosmologies matter. They are not maps for getting somewhere. They are the rules by which that somewhere operates. You don't like to see ads, and please trust me when I tell you I don't like having to place them, but these are challenging times on the platform, especially for small independent creators like myself trying to make content for you 7 days a week. So if you enjoy the stories, the lore, and the deep dives I create, maybe consider showing your support for the work by hyping the video, subbing, and doing all the things. And if you really want to support the channel, enjoy the art in my videos, have interest in custom world-building resources, or want to choose and direct a future lore topic just like this one, check out my Patreon that you can join 100% for free with no strings. Links to sign up, along with a Buy Me a Coffee tip jar, are in the show notes below. Before the first established cosmology, before D&D's earliest scholars even looked to the sky with such questions, there was the original 1974 box set, 3 brown booklets that looked like they were printed in someone's garage, because essentially they were. These original rule sets casually reference planar terms such as higher planes, most often in a spell of the same name. Contact Higher Plane allowed a magic user to seek esoteric and dangerous knowledge from entities beyond their known reality, each higher plane promising greater insight as well as greater risk. That early material mentioned the astral as a nebulous concept, but offered no named heavens, no alignment chart of divine realms, and certainly no complete cosmic diagram. It did establish the mood, or in the parlance of 2026, the vibes of what lie beyond the standard dungeon crawl. These were the earliest hints of an unseen existence where knowledge had a price and a clever wizard could discover too much. Additional concepts such as the ethereal plane would slowly begin to emerge a year later in 1975's Greyhawk Supplement No. 1. The sparse lore of this early publication did not offer any detailed planar destinations, so much as metaphysical conveniences born from its introduction of magic items such as oil and armor of etherealness that allowed characters to pass through solid matter or to become out of phase. This is relevant because it required a practical explanation of why this magic sometimes acted weird, or even to describe the place where ghosts technically come from. The ethereal plane was not yet fully developed, but the idea was there, a parallel condition of existence where ordinary barriers no longer behaved as they should. This all suggested worlds beyond our world and the fantastical adventures or dread terrors that might be found there. The earliest steps toward a true foundational model of these higher planes emerged from the pages of the Strategic Review in 1976, where Gary Gygax began to formulate the concept of outer planes as well as alignment in an essay titled The Meaning of Law and Chaos in Dungeons & Dragons and Their Relationships to Good and Evil. Approximately 1 year later, in Dragon Magazine number 8, the TSR founder would expand upon those concepts in his article, Planes, the Concepts of Spatial, Temporal, and Physical Relationships in D&D. For many, this 1977 Dragon write-up, along with subsequent first edition texts found in the 1978 Player's Handbook, the 1979 Dungeon Master's Guide, and 1980's Deities and Demigods, each serve as important early formal mappings of the outer dimensions. 16 distinct outer planes based on moral alignment, creating a cohesive geometric system that introduced many of the realms as we know them today. The actual term of Great Wheel would not be officially used for another decade, but to be fair, one look at this early illustration certainly represents more of a great rectangle. Still, these foundational texts firmly establish the planar connections as the basis and all but name for the Great Wheel cosmology that would influence Dungeons & Dragons moving forward. The first edition Manual of the Planes firmly codified this structure into a proper reference work in 1987, where the nomenclature would first officially state what is familiar to many even today. Quote, "The conventional view of the outer planes is of a great wheel divided into 16 pieces." This seminal publication would detail the outer planes, a hub with 16 spokes, 4 elemental inner planes, the para-elemental and quasi-elemental planes to fill the gaps, the prime material at the center, the ethereal wrapping it, and the astral connecting everything. The weakness of this early Great Wheel model was just that. It was a model, an academic diagram rather than a living, breathing geography with which to interact. The planes were now laid out in a form future editions could build on, and even the hostilities between devils and demons had been established across the lower planes, though its official name would not be coined for another 4 years. However, the eternal war of law and chaos would find its forever name as the Blood War with the arrival of the second edition and 1991's monstrous compendium for the Outer Planes, as well as the stellar Planescape setting 3 years later. Planescape in particular would make the Blood War central to its identity, giving it a scale and size far beyond anything seen before or since. However, the why, what, and how, as in why do fiends fight, why do gods care about mortal worship, what does any of this mean to the people who live there, and how do mortals interact with these planes, were all mostly left to individual dungeon masters to answer for themselves. The first edition Great Wheel model could not answer those important questions, but its governing principles were set. The cosmos was arranged around the influence and ideologies of moral and philosophical extremes. The Planescape setting for 2nd edition would arrive to add many refinements, answer those questions, and finally, give the cosmology a voice. 2nd edition did not invent the Great Wheel cosmology, but it would be in the Planescape setting where planar travel was firmly established by transforming that fundamental model from a reference framework into a living, breathing, and philosophically combative reality. However, if you want to grasp any understanding of the Planescape multiverse, you must first cast aside everything you know about physical distance and geography and begin to think in the abstract, where space is an illusion, distance a matter of perspective, and belief can become law. Here, the power of divine devotion carries real weight. It can mold communities, empower factions, and at times alter the world around those who hold strong enough convictions. Not a single faith, but theology as a cosmological principle. The idea that what is worshipped, what is feared, what is collectively held as true by a given plane holds leverage and influence of the shape to come. Gods, fiends, celestials, and mortal cultures all interpret the planes through their own beliefs. A Batazu devil sees the 9 hells far differently than a frightened merchant from Tribor who has only heard the stories. A priest of Mystra, a Doomguard philosopher, and a Githyanki raider may all agree that the astral exists while disagreeing on what it actually means, which makes these mortal drawn diagrams to some degree a record of what the multiverse currently believes about itself. The setting never lets you forget that an idea held fast and in significant numbers can become both dangerous and tangible. The Great Wheel is a reality-defining framework bound by 3 distinct metaphysical rules. The unity of rings, which dictates that all paths eventually loop back onto themselves, evidenced physically in the ring-shaped city of Sigil, or the Great Wheel itself, as well as conceptually, whereby actions and events eventually return to their point of origin. The Rule of Threes, which declares that all great mysteries and structures resolve in triads, such as the 3 conflict factions of law, chaos, and neutrality, the upper, lower, and boundary breakdowns of the outer planes, and the classic Planescape phrase, if it happens twice, look for the third. And finally, the center of all, the profound truth that in an infinite cosmos, wherever you happen to be standing is the exact center of reality. Because the planes are infinite, every single location, whether it's a tavern in Sigil, a Lulthite drow temple in the Underdark, or a simple patch of mud on an unknown layer in the infinite abyss, each carries an equal claim to being the absolute center of all reality. At the starting point of our Great Wheel examination sits the prime material plane. This is the mundane physical universe where standard mortal worlds exist. It is a realm of heavy stone, predictable physics, and balanced everyday matter. It acts as the anchor of the physical mind, but it is far from the heart of existence. The raw, unshaped building blocks that make up the material world originate from primal realms of hostile energies, indifferent to any concepts of good and evil. They are called the inner planes and consist of pure matter, earth, fire, air, and water. Elemental maelstroms balanced against the cosmic forces of the positive energy plane, which radiates pure life, and the negative energy plane, which embodies total destruction. Where the borders of these massive elemental forces crash into one another, they bleed together, coalescing to create hybrid frontier territories, the para- and quasi-elemental planes. But if the inner planes represent the body of the multiverse, it is the outer planes that represent its soul. These are 16 distinct realms arranged in a massive ring, like numbers on a clock, that mirror the varied moral alignments and beliefs of the multiverse, split by great ideological battlegrounds. High above sit the upper planes of good, 7 realms stretching from the heroic domains of Isgard to the peaceable kingdoms of Arcadia, featuring the orderly 7 heavens of Mount Celestia and the wild, passionate joy of Arborea, all linked by the flowing river Oceanus. Diametrically opposed lie the lower planes, 7 realms of evil spanning its dark arc from the howling madness of Pandemonium to the iron lands of Acheron, highlighted by the rigid cruelty of the 9 hells and the infinite chaos and anarchy of the abyss, connected by the foul and memory-erasing waters of the river Styx. Balancing the axis of the Great Wheel are the planes of law and chaos, containing the precise mathematical order of Mechanus and the swirling, ever-changing chaotic soup of Limbo. At the geographic hub of this Great Wheel sits a 17th plane unlike the others, the Outlands, the plane of true neutrality, where the competing ideological forces cancel each other into an uneasy equilibrium. Connecting these massive layers of existence to the prime material realm are 2 distinct transitional highways. A planar traveler may reach the outer planes by entering the silver, timeless void known as the astral plane, where the colossal, stony corpses of forgotten gods float in the dread silence and shimmering curtains of prismatic color open into the various outer realms. To reach the elemental inner planes, one must navigate the foggy, shifting currents of the ethereal plane, traveling through the misty shoreline of the border ethereal, then passing into its deeper reaches where demi-planes drift and spinning vortices of vapor pull travelers into the elemental worlds. At the absolute center of this magnificent wheel rising from the Outlands is an immense spire, and floating at the apex, directly above the spire's peak, sits the ring-shaped metropolis known as Sigil. The cage, as it is sometimes called, is an open-faced torus, interior-facing, so that when standing on any street, you can see the buildings curving up and away overhead until they become one with the flickering lights of the buildings on the opposite side of the ring. Cagers refer to these opposite city lights as the stars of Sigil. You will break your brain trying to make any logical sense of what is the inconceivable logic and surreal nature of both the city and the spire upon which it sits. Both defy standard geometry and are impossible to reach through any normal means of flying, climbing, or even planar travel, and the sooner you simply accept this, the better. Sigil is the functional heart of this multiverse. Within, portals can appear randomly on any wall, door, or archway, connecting to every corner of existence, provided you possess the right key, which is why it is called the City of Doors and why it is such a critical hub to everyone who travels the planes. Sigil is a place where angels and demons sit in the same taverns, where philosophers argue reality into existence, and where the absolute truth of the cosmos is laid bare. That the planes are not just places you visit, but ideas that shape all that exists around them. The core innovation of the Planescape setting was that it took the alignment system seriously as a cosmological force, and then populated the planes with beings who had their own fiercely held opinions about it. In the City of Doors reside 15 such factions, survivors from a culling known as the Great Upheaval that compete as rival philosophical schools, each convinced they had correctly read the intent of the multiverse and organized their lives around it. Law enforced by strength, entropy as sacred principle, divine skepticism, or pure nihilism. The factions fought, politicked, and occasionally purged each other in a city that technically belonged to none of them. Of course, no discussion of Sigil would be complete without mention of the mysterious Lady of Pain, deserving of her own dedicated deep dive because she is Planescape's most enduring contribution to the Dungeons & Dragons mythology. The Lady of Pain is Sigil's sovereign, and quite possibly the most dangerous being that a traveler or god could encounter. She is an imposing, majestic, yet cold humanoid figure that floats above Sigil's streets, her face an impassive mask of neutrality ringed by a halo of shimmering deadly blades. She does not speak, she does not explain the rules of Sigil, but rest assured, she does aggressively enforce them. The Lady of Pain matters most because it is her mandate by which Sigil is closed to all gods, and because no lore is given that provides a complete or satisfactory answer for what she is, where she came from, or what limits her godlike authority. Her existence hints at a level of power arguably beyond the divine, and her refusal to explain herself implies that the Great Wheel has mechanisms that even the gods do not fully understand. Perhaps the most interesting facet of early D&D cosmological lore is found on the pages of the 2000 adventure Die Vecna Die. This module details an innovative and canonical event that bridges the transition from the lore of 2nd to 3rd edition. The adventure is explicitly framed as a multiverse-scale catastrophe, serving a metatextual goal of providing an in-universe justification for an out-of-game edition change. The plot begins with Vecna trapped in Ravenloft's demi-plane of dread, but still pursuing a plan he had prepared before his imprisonment. As the story is told, the Lich God of Secrets plants tablets inscribed in the language primeval, which ancient lore tells us is the fundamental source code of creation. Knowing the greyhawk demigod Ayuz will find them and believe they contain the means to become a greater god. When Ayuz comes for Vecna's power, the Lich springs his trap, destroying Ayuz and absorbing his divinity to escape the dark powers of Ravenloft and make his way towards Sigil. Guided by the mysterious entity known only as the Serpent Mox-like, Vecna would use a series of cosmic loopholes to bypass the ancient laws of the multiverse and breach the wards protecting the City of Doors. He enters and enacts a reality-warping ritual inside Sigil, where no god is permitted to enter, held as strictly neutral ground by the Lady of Pain. Vecna attempts to use the City of Doors as the crux of his grand design, not just his own divinity, but control over the shape and power of the multiverse itself. The Lady of Pain, of course, intervenes, refusing to let Sigil become Vecna's weapon to rewrite reality, countering his Planar infection. While many sages believe that the Lady of Pain could have easily erased Vecna from existence, or at least banished him to one of her forever mazes, she instead uses her power, along with the aid of a group of stalwart heroic adventurers, to eject the Lich God and stitch the breaking universe back together. Vecna is defeated and removed from Sigil, but the adventure does not pretend that his presence left no consequence in its wake. The Lady of Pain attempts to repair the framework of existence, yet cannot fully erase all of Vecna's unholy infection. Some planes begin to drift away, others collide, the nature of the material plane is altered. The result of this reality-breaking struggle was a total cosmological reset. Die Vecna Die does not provide a tidy blueprint for the incoming 3E Cosmology. However, it gives the lore an official point of rupture, a moment that gave later writers room to present their alternative. Still, this is the lore doing something unusual. It acknowledges in-universe that the cosmology changed rather than pretending the previous version never existed. This event would also cement the Lady of Pain as a supreme force and Planescape's final gift to the canon, a being whose power is precisely the authority to determine what shape the multiverse takes when reality is forced to reset. And it would be from the remnants of Die Vecna Die's cosmic reboot that the texts of the 3rd edition would emerge, presenting Planar sages with some of their most fervent disputes. The Great Wheel, the World Tree. Countless debates and scholarly arguments have been waged across many a tavern over which is the proper 3E model. The catalyst for such academic conflict stemmed directly from the 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons, carrying 2 distinct cosmological frameworks into its history and lore, and so any determination on what was proper or true became firmly rooted in whichever world you called home. The Great Wheel would be the default cosmology for D&D's core 3rd edition worlds, but not for its most popular. The Forgotten Realms campaign setting actually arrived first in June 2001, presenting Abir Torel's planes built around a new world tree model, distinctly organized around divine dominions and more traditional mythological structures. 3 months later, the September release of the Manual of the Planes would establish the Great Wheel once again as the default multiverse for the Greyhawk, or as it was now called, the core setting. The result gave us 2 frontline worlds, each with its own incompatible cosmology. Stepping out of the meta for just a moment, the reasoning for this cosmic duality is actually pretty straightforward. While Greyhawk and the Great Wheel served as the default setting for the 1st edition, and later shared that spotlight with Planescape toward the end of the 2nd edition era, the arrival of the 3rd edition brought a deliberate shift in publishing strategy. Wizards of the Coast officially kept Greyhawk as the underlying foundational world setting, but they also began to intentionally diminish the Greyhawk branding by scrubbing the Greyhawk name from the covers of 3rd edition core rulebooks, a fact clearly illustrated with the 2000 release of the Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and Monster Manual. Whether right or wrong, it was widely assumed that moving away from the Greyhawk brand allowed designers to give Orth veterans a functional, ready-to-use mythology that still kept the lore approachable, while also ensuring that new players could jump into the setting without feeling weighed down by decades of complex Greyhawk backstory and regional politics. What some may not realize is the Forgotten Realms, introduced all the way back in 1987, was already an available and alternative setting in both the 1st and 2nd edition. However, by the launch of the 3rd edition, the Forgotten Realms had quickly outpaced all other settings in terms of sales and popularity, on its way to becoming D&D's flagship setting. While Wizards of the Coast never officially stated or used terminology such as flagship, the data is self-evident. Spanning the era of the 3rd edition, including the 3.5 update, my casually unscientific Google Fu research would eclipse 30 Forgotten Realms-specific adventures and supplemental lore and rulebooks, and this does not include the dozens upon dozens of Realms lore novels. This would unsurprisingly overshadow the handful of Greyhawk-branded publications. I will acknowledge that there are those who would argue this is an unfair comparison, given that most of the core books were based in the world of Greyhawk, as the name had been scrubbed, but that also kind of makes my point. The Forgotten Realms had become the bell cow, a fact that would be borne out in the modern lore of the 5 and 5.5 edition era. Nonetheless, Wizards of the Coast wanted the core rebranded Greyhawk setting and the Forgotten Realms to function as separate, viable product lines. Reorganizing faerun's cosmology allowed its authors to create a framework more fitting to its unique lore, aimed at giving Realms lore fans a unique, self-contained setting without forcing its players to reconcile what was determined to be an incompatible cosmic model. And so the Forgotten Realms saw a full cosmological retcon to the world tree. However, just because it was a retcon does not itself make the model a bad idea. In some ways, the World Tree cosmology was a valid answer to a real Realms lore problem. The Forgotten Realms, more than any other setting, had an enormous pantheon. Abir Torel, the accurate and proper naming of the world until the 4th edition split, had long treated its divine relationships, rivalries, and overlapping portfolios as critical to its well-established lore. The Forgotten Realms planes needed to be more clearly defined by this mythos-heavy theme, so the cosmology would be organized as a great tree, whose roots and vast branching structures connected the various planes, with travel between them becoming a matter of navigating its interconnected transitive pathways and portals. At the center stood a shared trunk, consisting of the material plane, the ethereal plane, and the plane of shadow. From that trunk extended the inner planes of element and energy, along with the outer planes and the attached divine realms. The 17 planes of the Great Wheel were replaced by 26 completely new planes divided into celestial, neutral, and fiendish realms, each physically connected as limbs of this world tree. Their character and properties would be shaped chiefly by the will of the gods and the doctrine of their pantheons that held dominion there, rather than by the Great Wheel's established alignment-first arrangement. While certainly diminished, alignment still mattered, of course, but in this model, a plane was no longer slotted by an assigned moral address and then populated accordingly. Its primary nature followed the divine forces that claimed it. Perhaps the most unique aspect of the world tree, one that separates it from other cosmological models, is lore that confirms the world tree as sentient, actively monitoring and even judging those that traveled upon it, resisting being used as a shortcut to the point of blocking or misdirecting travelers. The world tree's mindful planar conduits linked many of the celestial realms. Its roots reached into Arvindor and Dwarfholm, and its branches rose through the heavens towards Selune's divine realm, the Gates of the Moon. It did offer select shortcuts between agreeing celestial planes, though the tree did not often welcome casual traffic. Travelers could find their passage blocked by celestial guardians, and only those judged to have a worthy purpose were likely to be allowed through. The fiendish realms had their own darker route, the River of Blood, a foul waterway that flowed through most of the fiendish planes, beginning somewhere in the infinite abyss and running strongly through the Blood Rift and the Nine Hells before winding through other hostile realms and eventually spilling into fated depths. The Abyss, the Nine Hells, and Blood Rift formed one unusual branch because all three were coterminous. Devils, demons, and Yugoloths fought for influence there, while the River of Blood gave the bold, the desperate, and the terminally foolish a way to move between such fiendish planes without returning to Abir Toril. In this model, the astral and ethereal planes, as well as the plane of shadow, remained transitive for passage. The ethereal overlapped the material plane as a ghostly reflection of the physical world, allowing travelers to move through corresponding locations beyond the reach of ordinary walls and roads. The plane of shadow reflected the material plane as well, though as a dimmer, far stranger, and less stable mirror. It allowed swift travel across a world, and by the 3.5 era, it also served as Abir Toril's primary known connection to other material worlds, such as Greyhawk. In this model, the astral plane still carried travelers toward the planes beyond, but it no longer behaved like the open astral of the Great Wheel. The world tree's astral routes followed the cosmology's branching structure. A traveler could enter the astral through planar magic, such as plane shift or astral projection, then follow a color pool toward a chosen destination. But this was a committed, one-way trip. Once the journey had begun, only pools leading toward that chosen destination would appear. A traveler could not reverse course or detour to another destination without first returning to the material plane to begin once again. Under normal conditions, you could not simply step from one outer or inner plane to another by astral travel alone. The material plane remained the crossroads, and cosmological law would mandate, with few exceptions, that every conventional journey through its planes must begin there. Two notable departures from the established conduits of planar travel were found in the demi-plane Cynosure, also known as the Hall of Meeting, and the Fugue plane, that each stood detached from the world tree's astral connectivity. Cynosure was the neutral meeting ground of the gods, a small, finite demi-plane built as an open-air hall beneath a star-filled sky, with portals leading to the divine realms of the world's pantheon. Portals that could only be activated by beings of divine rank. No astral color pools could lead there. A planar traveler could not cast astral projection, drift through the branches of the world tree, and arrive at this godly council chamber, ensuring that Cynosure was not a signposted destination on the world tree's road. It was a locked room at the end of divine privilege. The Fugue plane was stranger still, yet held arguably the most critical role in the new cosmology. It was the place to which mortal souls were drawn after death, a gray, featureless expanse ruled by Kellumbor, Lord of the Dead, and where souls gathered to await their judgment, collection, abandonment, or damnation. Here the servants and envoys of gods and divine powers arrived for those souls claimed by one or more faiths. The fugue plane served as the holding ground where the dead discovered whether their faith had purchased them a destination in the afterlife. For those without such faith, there was the Wall of the Faithless. The wall had been created long before Kelemvor's reign by Merkel, the old Lord of Bones, a grim monument and fate built from the souls of those who had lived without sincere devotion to any faith or god. Godless souls were then pressed into the wall and slowly dissolved by what the lore describes as a supernatural green mold, enduring a painful, fully conscious near eternity until they were completely obliterated. This bleak fate of the godless has been a controversial facet of the lore, worthy of a more dedicated discussion, so let me know down in the comments if you'd like to see a more robust examination covering the lore on the Wall of the Faithless. Regardless, for the living, the fugue plane was not an intended destination, and standard planar travel did not provide a casual route into the waiting lobby of the dead. But it was not absolutely sealed. Divine servants, infernal agents, and other exceptional powers could reach it through tightly controlled portals tied to the business of the afterlife. 3rd edition had carved a unique but divided path to offer a cosmic duality, where different worlds could look up into the night sky and disagree on reality's framework without pretending one of them had to be lying. However, 4th edition would look at that arrangement and decide it was time to simplify and streamline, an innocuous statement that would leave lasting ruin in its wake. The transition to the world access model in Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition represents one of the most contentious creative decisions in the game's history. The world access would abandon both the Great Wheel and World Tree models to place the mortal world at a center pivot point between two infinite expanses, a vertical axis symbolic of a tug-of-war between two ancient titanic forces, the gods of permanent order in the astral sea above and the primordials of wild creation in the elemental chaos below. The lore driving this cosmological remodel was not invented for 4th edition's present day, but was instead a major event retconned into Abir Torel's ancient history. Before mortals existed, before the planes had settled into their current shapes, the gods and the primordials fought a great war over the nascent world that the 4E canon would call the Dawn War. While out of scope for this exploration, I have previously covered the Dawn War at great depth in a series of Realms lore videos, all linked below if you'd like to learn more. At the center of this cosmic axis lies the mortal world, acting as the grand compromise of creation and symbol of divine victory in the Dawn War. Here, the gods took the raw, wild matter of the universe and bound it together with permanent laws, creating a stable home for mortals to live, build, and die. The world of the living is closely sandwiched between two mirror dimensions known as parallel planes. If you step sideways through reality, you might find yourself in the Feywild, a blindingly bright echo of our world where nature runs rampant, magic flows like water, and the emotional volume of existence is turned up to 11. Step in the opposite direction, however, and you enter the Shadowfell, a bleak, monochromatic mirror of decay and twilight, a somber, dim world where the landscape leaches color from the living and where most mortal souls must pass on their way to the realm of the Raven Queen before continuing their journey to whatever afterlife lay beyond. If you look up from this mortal center, you gaze into the astral sea. Travelers do not walk here, they sail across the spiritual void on great planar ships. This is a vast, shimmering ocean of silver mist and starlight, where many former outer plane dominions now float like islands, reimagined as something between a pocket dimension and a heavenly body drifting in a celestial sea. But if you descend below, past the mortal realm through the bedrock of reality, you plunge into the elemental chaos. This is the roaring, bottomless foundry of the multiverse. It is a turbulent tempest where mountains of stone float through skies of liquid fire, and oceans of acid crash against shores of pure lightning. This is the ancient domain of the primordials, beings of pure matter who wish nothing more than to tear down the stable structures of the gods. And at the absolute deepest, darkest floor of this elemental storm now sits a horrific gaping rift known as the Abyss, born when the mad god Thurisdan dropped the seed of the purest evil and malice into the elemental cradle. This retcon cosmic origin story holds that the Abyss is a cancer that twists the raw elements into nightmares, birthing the endless, howling hordes of demons and their demonic overlords. 4th edition arrived in 2008 with a mandate to simplify, streamline, and make the game more accessible to players raised as much on game controllers as dice. For some, these were not unreasonable goals. However, this simplicity came with a heavy cost: the abandonment of established, narratively resonant, and historically valued planar geography and lore. The genesis of the problems to follow really began at the planning stages, with the fact that the world access model was first designed as the default cosmology for 4th edition's own points of light setting. The issues then arose through forcibly retconning the model into Forgotten Realms history through the aforementioned Dawn War event, as well as a cataclysm called the Spellplague, and a contrived splitting of a Bir Torel into twin planets. The fundamental flaw of the world axis lie in its aggressive reductionism. It was explicitly engineered to serve a highly specific, combat-heavy world and gameplay loop. 4th edition designers sought to make the planes immediately accessible to mid-level adventurers by stripping away the complex, philosophical hazards of the outer planes. In doing so, they replaced a grand interconnected ecosystem of alignment and belief with a localized sandbox. By flattening the multiverse into the astral sea and the elemental chaos, the world axis traded intellectual depth for tactical convenience. The Great Wheel had functioned as a brilliant thought experiment where ideals like law and chaos held physical weight. By contrast, the world axis reduced these eternal conflicts to literal turf wars between a smaller, greatly diminished pantheon of gods and primordials, a design that was, as history would prove, woefully short-sighted. It assumed players wanted the planes to be easily conquerable dungeons, rather than distinct realms of awe-inspiring surreal mystery to be discovered. You only have to look at the Nine Hells or the Blood War to truly see the damage and ideological dismissal brought on by the world axis cosmology. Under the traditional Great Wheel, the Nine Hells stood as the absolute lawful evil manifestation of tyranny and order fighting a forever war against chaos. Its 9 descending layers formed a rigid physical infernal hierarchy, and its relationship with the outer planes gave its lawful evil mandate a position within the moral structure of the entire cosmos. In simplified terms, hell was not just where the devils lived. Under the world access model, the hells were uprooted, isolated, and transformed into a literal physical island or planetary body floating within the astral sea. This change turning a realm of ideological evil with influences dead set upon purging all traces of chaos into just another high-level location for tactical combat. The Nine Hells still exist in the 4th edition, but the reason they exist, the metaphysical necessity of a lawful plane in service of a greater ideological mandate, has been erased. The world axis model had fundamentally broke all logic surrounding the Blood War. But as it would turn out, that was perfectly acceptable to the 4E designers, because for all intents and purposes, the 4th edition lore declared the Blood War was now over. The official claim found in the 4E Manual of the Planes was that the Blood War hostilities had subsided. You see, the Nine Hells displacement was compounded by a second change that cut even deeper into the established lore. In the 4th edition, Asmodeus was no longer an archdevil, he was a god. In the wake of the Spellplague, the Lord of the Nine had murdered a deity named Azuth, absorbed his divine spark, and claimed a seat among the Pantheon. However, his divinity was clumsily implemented, where the design intent was to sever the last threads connecting the Nine Hells and the Abyss to the Blood War that gave both meaning in the first place. According to the 4E lore, Asmodeus used his newly acquired divine might to physically grab the entire planar realm of the Abyss and simply cast it into the furthest depths of the elemental chaos. The Lord of the Ruby Rod had effectively won the Blood War. This contrived armistice transformed the eternal war of law and chaos, a conflict that had raged since recorded time and drove the ideology of every devil into nothing more than a sullen and inactive Cold War truce. A change so short-sighted that it would be one of the first major retcons performed by the text of the 5th edition. Now, in the spirit of giving credit where credit is due, the world access model was not entirely devoid of good ideas, most notably when their lore was additive and not destructive. 4th edition updates to the vague Plane of Shadow and the Plane of the Fairy into the Shadowfell and the Feywild respectively were a massive success. These echo planes provide atmospheric playgrounds for all new adventures and world building. Additionally, within the Shadowfell, the creation of the Raven Queen stands as one of the best thought-out deities of recent memory. These specific updates endured into the modern game because they filled existing narrative gaps with new lore, not tearing down and retconning old revered pillars. However, these successful additions cannot excuse what is perhaps the most damning and willful act of 4th edition's careless lore implementation. I speak of the intentional fracturing of the Realms lore calendar. To force the world access model onto the flagship Forgotten Realms setting, the designers advanced the timeline by nearly a century using the in-universe event known as the Spellplague, a cataclysmic storm of blue fire that aged out cherished characters, collapsed established civilizations and kingdoms, and needlessly murdered many deities. I have barely scratched the surface of the Spellplague details. There are so many disastrous, unnecessary, and short-sighted impacts that I had to make a dedicated video just to list them all, which you can check out at the link included in the show notes below. The world access was not without defenders, although I would argue the vast majority of them came into Dungeons & Dragons as new players with 4th edition as their first significant experience, and/or never cared much for the lore to begin with. Dungeons & Dragons is not only a game for new players, it has a rich history and canon, and the simplifications of the world access came at the cost of decades of accumulated lore. The multiverse had been simplified, rearranged, and a century of Realms lore erased. Then came the awkward part. It would only be 2 years into the 4E launch when the D&D Essentials product line would hint at the first signs of acknowledgement that significant mistakes had been made, and it was soon clear that the only way to walk back the devastation and start to put the old pieces back together would be to enact the single largest acts of retcon in D&D's storied history. 4th edition had moved continents, erased civilizations, killed gods, suspended the Blood War, shifted the planes, and parked Hell and the Abyss in places they had no business being. Somebody would have the near-impossible task of explaining this. It was called the Second Sundering, and that somebody was the 5th edition. The 4E era was the nadir of Dungeons & Dragons. The world access changes had been widely rejected, and the canon had been left in a state that would be politely described as compromised. The texts on the pages of 5th edition's first publications, the Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide, really needed to acknowledge the sins of 4E and signal a return to the classic Great Wheel model in some form. And I believe most would agree that, on balance, faced with the great many challenges it did, that they succeeded. The Outer Planes were restored to their alignment-based positions. The 9 Hells and the Abyss are now in their rightful place. The Blood War has resumed its ideological war, while the Yugoloths continue to maximize their profiteering from both sides. The World Tree and World Access cosmologies had strayed far from the conceptual origins of earlier models to become near literal maps of the cosmos. This was a mistake, and 5th edition made the wise decision to once again reinforce an emphasis on the Great Wheel as a mortal-drawn diagram for understanding multiversal relationships that cannot be flattened into literal terrestrial directions. This helps avoid a common misunderstanding found in previous planar maps. In 5e, it is understood that you cannot walk far enough across Acheron to eventually breach the borders of Mechanus or the 9 Hells just because the map you bought in Sigil shows those names touching. The Great Wheel explains affinity, connection, and metaphysical relation as abstract concepts. It is an image for a mortal mind too small to see the whole. And this subtle change also allows other contradictory models to now coexist more honestly. The 5e Dungeon Master's Guide presents the World Tree and Eberron's Orrery as alternative cosmologies rather than retcons or mistakes that must be erased, even though World Access model, it seems, has its place in the multiverse. In this regard, 5th edition has a more mature and accepting relationship with continuity than any previous edition. 5th edition retains the Feywild and Shadowfell, correctly recognizing that those planes had become too useful to discard. It retains the Astral Sea's visual influence, even when using the older label of Astral Plane. And 5e describes the elemental chaos as the region where the elemental planes mingle and collide, rendering some remnants of the 4e concept harmless without sacrificing the individual planes of fire, air, water, and earth. 4th edition had, more than any edition before it, burned down existing lore pillars, some of which would be difficult or even impossible to restore in the 5th edition. This left the 5e designers with an unenviable dilemma. In some cases, the world access left changes for which no elegant narrative fix existed. For severe offenses, the 5e design team simply had to bite the bullet and issue outright retcons. Faced with such a daunting task, 5e launched the Second Sundering, an historic retcon event designed to unwind what damage they could and rebuild within what remained. At the center of this cosmic repair was the Overgod Ao, who stepped in to rewrite the Tablets of Fate. By restructuring the governing laws, Lord Ao physically uncoupled the twin worlds of Abir and Torel, separating their landmasses and restoring the traditional pantheons to life. Deities that were unceremoniously killed off or merged to fit 4e's streamlined tactical needs were suddenly returned, and entire civilizations that had disappeared were restored. However, some facets of the 4e damage were so broken that they could not be walked back even by the power of a full retcon and rewrite. The most permanent of these scars was the Spellplague's Lost Century, where the 5th edition would be forced to live with the damage. There was no logical story bridge to claw back 97 years of lost time and its countless impacts to published novels and nearly every living thing in Realms lore. It was not always graceful, but it was far better than the alternative. Yet the lost years remained. The world would never go back to exactly how it was before. Realms lore history and the fractured timeline were permanently altered, leaving a century-wide void that future writers would always have to work around. The mistakes of the world access showed what is lost when a cosmology optimizes for convenience over consequence. Still, 5th edition recovered much of what was lost, and the design team deserves immense credit for the effort. By prioritizing the rich history of the game over short-term trends, the 5e tech successfully restored the soul of the Dungeons & Dragons multiverse. What the Cosmology ultimately is in any edition is a claim about what matters most, and the Great Wheel's return in 5th edition is, among many other things, the Multiverse's verdict on that claim, that a cosmology is not successful just because it is easy to explain. It is successful when a player looks to the stars, sees a portal, or casts a planar spell, and understands that such cosmic travel may change far more than just your location. That is the shape of all things. If you find the grand history of the Forgotten Realms as fascinating as I do, then I have a full Realms lore timeline you will almost certainly find interesting. However, if you are the more conspiracy-minded, then you must check out my D&D Declassified on the Spellplague Conspiracy. Until next time, take care, my friends.